Hi, I'm a firmware expert. You've heard of hardware, your phone is hardware, and you've heard of software, an app on your phone is software. So what is firmware? As its name suggests, it's somewhere halfway between hardware and software. If you want to change the software on your phone, you just install a new app. If you want to change the hardware of your phone, you need a new phone. Firmware is installed during the manufacturing process, and for many devices it never changes after that. But some devices allow a firmware update, either automatically or with user intervention. So what does firmware look like? Well, if you've ever seen a Windows computer, you may have seen the BIOS screen, which looks something like that. That's actually firmware. But most of the time firmware doesn't display anything at all. It's sitting in the background. You can't see it or interact with it in any way. So what does firmware actually do? Firmware is typically the first 1 second of a device's startup. It's responsible for setting up the hardware and loading the operating system, or OS, something like Windows or Android or iOS or whatever. The OS is what you see when you start up your phone or computer. Some devices try to confuse you by combining the firmware with the operating system and calling it a firmware update. Ignore those horrible people. What if the firmware is missing? Well, if there's no firmware, there's nothing to load the OS, and you have a brick. In some cases, it's possible to brick a device by doing a firmware update and then pulling the power halfway through. If you do that, it probably has to go back to the manufacturer for repair. So why should you care about firmware? Well, if it's working and everything's good, you probably don't, unless you like digging into the details about how things work. You love to see flashing lights, or you want to change the OS, for example, to run Linux on your Mac. Or perhaps you like programming in C instead of JavaScript. Or maybe you're interested in contributing to open source firmware projects such as U-Boot. Firmware is a whole other world. It's behind every device from your TV to the brakes in your car. I find it fascinating, and perhaps you will too.